Hello, everyone. I'm Sudip, Chakrabarti, IIT Kharagpur, partner at Lightspeed. And I have the greatest pleasure to have my senior partner at Lightspeed and co-founder of Lightspeed, Ravi Mhatre, here with me. So thanks, Ravi, for making the time.
Thanks for having me, Sudip.
Absolutely. Thank you. So Ravi is a pretty well-known name in the IIT community, having backed the most number of IIT alumni-founded companies. He has been in the news quite a bit lately, so thanks again. But let me just hit a few highlights for those of you who don't know Ravi or hasn't followed his career in the last few years. So he started his career as a software engineer and then ran a product management group at Silicon Graphics early in the day. And then 17 years ago, he co-founded Lightspeed to invest in enterprise IT, mobility, and internet-based applications and services. So while Ravi has backed a number of companies over his long venture career, I just wanted to take a second and call out the IIT alumni-founded companies that he has backed from day one. Nutanix, AppDynamics, Rubrik, ThoughtSpot, Cosmix, Qbol, EdgeSpring, The Find, Pernix Data, Bromium, Zscaler, and probably have several others coming.
There may be.
He has also been recognized on the Forbes Midas list for top venture capitalists, and earlier this year was ranked 6th by New York Times among 20 top VCs in the world. And then last but not least, Ravi has a BS in electrical engineering and a BA in economics from Stanford and an MBA from Stanford Graduate School of Business. So unlike most of us, Ravi does not have the pleasure of remembering his AIR from his IIT JEE days, but we'll not hold that against you.
Well, the one thing I was going to say is I'm really glad my dad was an immigrant and came to the US, because from the statistics, if I had to try to compete on the IIT entrance exam, I may not have gotten admitted. It's easier to get into Stanford than it is IIT.
Absolutely. So on that note, Ravi, talk a little bit about your background. I know you grew up in multiple different places. Your dad was one of the first Indian origin entrepreneurs back in the day. Help us understand how that has influenced your outlook and what you do.
Yeah, he was, and I won't spend too much time on it, but as I've gotten older, I've really, come to appreciate, at some level, my origin story and the path my father took. He grew up in Mumbai, did his undergrad in India, and then he came to this country in the 50s, a little bit ahead of his time. He did a PhD in biochemistry, so, like people from the IT community, he was really, his background was in science. He was a scientist and really, and an engineer. And, he ended up getting into business a little bit unexpectedly. He got an offer he first was a research scientist in a lab. The company he worked for had a failing business, and they, asked him to go take a look at it because it was a fairly technical business in the biochemistry area. And he did it, and he had some success, again, without any formal training. We heard from some entrepreneurs actually earlier today on a panel. He was thrust into it and managed to succeed. And then basically, I think maybe because he was an immigrant to this country, he sort of decided he would go take whatever opportunity was made available on the business side, and because of that, he picked us up, my brother and I, and my mother, and moved us all around for different business opportunities that he was, whatever he was able to get. He had an opportunity. We lived in the Middle East for 4 years, running a very early life sciences business, and this was in the 80s. When I was in high school, he moved the family to Europe, and he was running a life sciences division of a large pharma company there. And then we actually landed in Silicon Valley my senior year of high school. We moved to Los Altos, and that was, that experience. I saw him basically come out here to take over. It was some tech that had been spun out from Stanford. There were basically 3 research scientists associated with, at the time, the company he was working for was a large pharma company called Becton Dickinson. They're based in New Jersey, but they had sort of said, hey, you're sort of a scientist, you know a little bit about business. Come out and shut this thing down that we somehow got involved with out of Stanford, and then you can come back. He was actually going to be the first non-white Anglo Section 16 officer of Becton Dickinson. It was kind of unprecedented. It's a company where kind of has a sort of white Anglo roots. And so he had a great opportunity to really become an established executive at a very reputable company and, kind of live out his career there. And we moved out here, and I was sort of, watching him, come home in the first sort of few months and really just, thinking that we would only be in California for a year and then move back to New Jersey where we had been before. And it sort of towards the end of the year, I remember him, talking to me and saying, Ravi, I think there's really something to this science, this basically research that's coming out of Stanford, and I think it could be something. And I thought California was nice, but I had friends back on the East Coast. I was ready to move, and I was like, really, Dad? And he basically had that same conversation with the powers that be at the Becton Dickinson and said, I think there's something here. And they said, well, if you decide you want to do that, then you should assume that there's not a place waiting for you to be an executive at back in New Jersey anymore. And oh, by the way, if you really want to do that, you need to find some money because we're not putting any more money into it. And he, to his credit, he went around and he found money at that time. This was in the early 80s. He couldn't raise venture capital. Venture capitalists were not doing a lot in life sciences, and he just looked too unconventional, which I'll get back to later. But he found a way to get a loan from a bank to keep the lights on and pay the salaries of the few early employees. And long story short, he stayed. He passed away a couple of years ago, but stayed basically in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley for the rest of his career. And I watched him grow this sort of fledgling, really more kind of research-oriented idea from 3 or 4 people into a business that was more than a $500 million run rate and several thousand employees. And now as a venture capitalist, we Sudip and I, we work with very early stage companies that start with one person or a handful of people who may not even be incorporated. And really, I have a lot of appreciation for the journey he took, both as someone who was not, native to the U.S., who came here and I think, had to break through a lot of the kind of glass ceilings that existed and, just be the person that he wanted to be and embrace the fact that he was different and, made that a strength as opposed to something that, he was going to let hold him back.
Yep.
So that really impacted me. I mean, that sort of caused me in many ways to become, I think, the person that I am, and it's we'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll come back to that point in a second.
Yeah.
But you started your career as a software engineer.
I did.
And you then, transitioned over to become a venture capitalist. What made you do that?
Yeah, I think some of that really is, I was definitely very impacted, obviously, by, my childhood growing up and watching, my father basically make that transition. And, I think as a result, I was always very curious about business. Indian father, I didn't really have a choice except to do something in science and engineering when I was going to college and having it paid for. But I did like engineering, and I started my career as an engineer, as Sudip said. I think at some point I really was curious about whether I could be successful in business, and as a result, I went back to Stanford Business School. I spent a few years in the technology industry running a product group, and then my entry into venture capital was I was still relatively young. I was I think 29. And but there was someone I met in the VC industry who really became a little bit of a mentor to me, the original person who got me into the industry. And what he said was, if you want to learn about business, I will spend the next 2 years teaching you about what startup businesses look like, some of the things, give you a crash course in what you need to look for. Because I was thinking after Silicon Graphics, the company I first went to, I would go join a startup. But he's like, I'll teach you about a little bit about business, and then you can go back into the tech industry. And in the meantime, you can work for me and help me find interesting companies to invest in. And I thought, great, this will be my opportunity to learn about business before I go do a startup. And long story short, I ended up working for this gentleman for several years, and then starting my own venture capital firm with some other people who I knew who were classmates from Stanford originally, and have been in the business now over 20 years. And
so you started Lightspeed 17 years back. What made you guys start yet another venture firm?
Yeah. It's a good question because it's like entrepreneurship in the sense that it's better to what do they say in the beginning? When the first time you do a company, there's a lot you don't know what you don't know, and it's good that we didn't know what we didn't know because it's been a long journey. It's been a really kind of amazing one, but a lot of highs and lows. We essentially were entrepreneurs in the VC industry, and our key thing, all 4 of us, We knew each other from Stanford originally. We'd all been in the tech industry as engineers, and then really gotten into venture capital each in our own way. And we'd all been in the industry between 3, 4, 5 years. And we realized that what we liked doing was really finding people who had technical backgrounds, who wanted to be technical founders. And we thought we really understood ways in which we could help those kinds of people build great companies. And there's a saying we've had since the beginning of founding Lightspeed, which is, our roots are really much more in the enterprise. If you want to, have a company that is really successful, it's as much as about, business design and business model design as it is about, kind of product design and architecture design. And so we really have a mission and I think a strategy as a firm which says if we can find people who, where we're really blown away by their technical aptitude and their technical vision and, some new architecture that they want to build that we think can be disruptive, we can't do that. But what we can do is we can really help those people figure out how to build and wrap around that, the most robust and, hopefully, the kind of arm them with the best possible way to build their business so that they can become, the world's best market leader with the technology that they're going to work so hard to build.
Got it. So then, shifting gears a little bit, you guys started Lightspeed, and then, obviously you backed a number of companies in the space, in both enterprise and consumer. Which one was the first company founded by an IIT alum, and why did you guys back that person or that team? Surprises, lessons learned from that experience?
Sure, yeah. I'm pretty sure the first ITians that I backed were Anand Rajmaran and Venki Harinarayan. I think Anand spoke earlier.
Yeah, earlier today.
But they actually were, unusual relative to most of the other ITians I've worked with in that they had already started one company called Jungly, and that was in the late 90s in the kind of Web 1.0 bubble. And they'd gotten acquired by Amazon. I think Anand was basically Jeff Bezos' CTO for a number of years, and Venki basically started the Amazon stores business, which is a huge part of the profit of Amazon e-commerce today. So they had some experience, but I met them, and when they started talking about the idea for Cosmix, it really was, sort of along the lines, they wanted to build the world's first vertical search engine, and that meant that, today we sort of take it for granted, but, at the time, this was sort of 2004, 2005 timeframe. If you typed a search into Google, you got one set of results. So if you typed in, as a good example, heart rate, you could get everything from, kind of the Mayo Clinic to, something like a heart rate monitor. And the search was very linear. And so their idea was, hey, can we create a search engine that figures out when you type in heart rate, you probably, want to know something about, cardiovascular health, and if you type in, flight time, it turns out the results you probably want are about travel. So they wanted to build this thing called a vertical search engine. And what I realized at the time was technically it was going to be an exceptionally challenging problem to solve. Anand and Venki are brilliant, and they had an amazing network of actually a lot of other IITians that they brought together. And so, it was a little like we felt like if we could really deliver this technology, it would be obvious to consumers that it's so much better than the state-of-the-art for search experience that, the business would take care of itself. So that was the beginning of the story. I guess if you want to know how it ended, the lesson learned, don't compete with Google in their core business. Google actually is a very amazing company. They have, I think, 80 or 90% share of the search market. I think they probably have 80 or 90% share of technically the best computer scientists in the world as it relates to search. And it was just sort of the rising, kind of water level in the tank over, the 4 to 5, or maybe it was 6 years that, Cosmix that was in existence. Google just steadily got better. And their vertical search wasn't perfect, but they did enough of it that it became very difficult as an independent search company to, try to get enough users or get enough distribution that we could succeed as an independent company. That being said, Cosmix ultimately was acquired by Walmart. It was a very successful outcome for the founders, for the team, for the investors. And today, Walmart bought Cosmix not because they wanted to be in the vertical search business, but they, understood that if they were going to compete with Amazon, their existential challenge was to find the kind of amazing technical talent that, most of you sitting in the audience represent. They needed that DNA, and they needed to bootstrap it quickly because in Walmart, I mean, company in Bentonville, they just didn't have the caliber of computer scientists that would allow them to build the kinds of services that Amazon had online. So, long story short, they acquired Cosmix. Cosmix today that was basically the anchor stone of what today is Walmart Labs, which is I think about 3,000 or 4,000 employees. It's sort of in Burlingame, but it is basically the kind of where the technology crown jewels are developed for Walmart, and it's actually allowed them to take share back from Amazon in online commerce, although they're still, I think, probably small relative to Amazon.
So then, I'm also curious, like later on, from that experience, you went on and moved and invested in companies like Nutanix, Rubrik, Zscaler. Any anecdotes to share with us, like how you found those teams? What made you jump in when many of the other VCs already had passed on those companies?
Each story is a little different. Nutanix, I met Dheeraj originally through Bipul Sinha, who I think was on an earlier panel today. Right. He had joined Lightspeed. I had recruited him to Lightspeed, and he made an introduction when Dheeraj and his two co-founders were really just a few months into starting Nutanix. But yeah, the question of Rubrik, obviously, if people were on the panel heard the story. Bipul actually was an investor at Lightspeed and decided to start a company. The minute he did that, I was sort of very regretful that he would not be, a partner at Lightspeed, a full-time partner. He's actually still a venture partner. But on the other hand, I was sort of like, well, Bipul's starting a company. Yep. I just found the best investment opportunity I probably could ever have. And Jay Chowdhury, who started Zscaler, I originally met him through the TIE network. My father was an early charter member of TIE. But yeah, the sort of origin stories are all a little different. Dheeraj and Bipul were both, when they started their respective companies, they had not been founders of companies before. Both of them had, experience working in the technology industry. But again, I mean, for Lightspeed, we view kind of where we have differentiation and what our core mission is in the venture capital landscape. If we can find people who we think are really, again, technically gifted and have a bold idea about how to build some new architectural stack that can change an industry, we feel like we can be the kind of partner that helps with creating the business that can ultimately go be the leader in the market. And in both the case of Dheeraj at Nutanix and Bipul at Rubrik, that kind of premise held very strongly. So it was a really obvious, I think, kind of fit for us, given the kind of investing we do. In the case of Jay, Jay had started a company prior to Zscaler, so he was more experienced. But very similar. Jay, when he started Zscaler, he had a very strong point of view about some technologies that he could bring together in a way that they had never been brought together before to create this high-performance web proxy in the cloud. And he thought if he could build that, he could change basically the way most web security was delivered to enterprises. And it was a pretty bold idea. When he started the company, nobody was thinking about the security being delivered from the cloud. It was something people were sort of like, enterprise will never buy that. But he really believed that this technology could be so much better that the product that he delivered, people would kind of have to buy it. And so we sort of were believers in that. He had more business experience, so he got the original business going, and that was the time that we invested. But very similar kind of story in terms of where the company originally started from, and what their differentiation was when they got to market.
Got it. And that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is, a lot of us, virtually all of us here have been trained as engineers, and many of us here, want to start companies or aspiring entrepreneurs. In your experience working with IIT founders, what would be your advice in terms of some of the first steps that an engineering founder, a technical founder should do in terms of as he or she is thinking about starting a company?
Well, yeah, and there's lots of different ways to start companies, but I will say, my experience has been with IITians, you've been through an amazing journey in terms of just probably getting accepted to IIT and the technical training you've had there, and also the experiences you've probably had working at the companies you're working at. So, you should play to that strength. And what I mean by that, I mean the kind of companies, I feel like I'm being a little bit repetitive, but there are a lot of companies that have been massively successful when the first principle is, hey, can I have an unfair advantage around a problem space that I'm familiar with and designing basically a new architecture that is going to change the way that problem gets solved. And I would say that for a lot of you in the audience, if you want to start a company, if you have a desire to be an entrepreneur, thinking about the things that in terms of technical problems and the way you've been solving them, and if there's some way you think that designing a new architecture could really change the rules of the game, that's probably a great thing to spend time thinking on as part of this notion of, do you want to start a company? Yeah, there's real value that that can come from having a strong engineering background, and that for firms like Lightspeed is those are the perfect situations where we think we can be the kind of partner to help you get going.
And on that note, like I remember when I was doing my first startup, and I very much felt I was a technical founder who didn't know anything about business. So one of the rookie mistakes we had made was hire the first person who could spell business as the CEO of the company. So any advice on how we should think as engineering or technical founders about hiring salesperson, marketing people, partners who could help us build a company?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say if you're a founder and your background is more from engineering or technology and you haven't done it before, then you really want to be thoughtful about how you do it. And there's no way to get the experience without actually walking the path. But the thing you can do early on is think about how to get some advisors and mentors that you feel have been through this sort of entrepreneurial cycle before, so that you and try to really absorb information from them. And I will say with Dheeraj at Nutanix and Bipul at Rubrik, who I've worked with now closely for a long time, actually they would be great mentors if you could find time from them. But they were incredible students of other people's experiences, and they used that to you can't avoid, you're going to make mistakes. That's part of the entrepreneurial journey. But to not, make obvious mistakes and to not, frankly, reinvent the wheel. I think that, that part, if you know you have strength in being, in technology, then really understanding that maybe the things you haven't seen before relate to some of, the other parts of building a business, and getting, and the IT community actually now, I think, has a number of people who've successfully built companies. So really, falling back on that community and trying to have, recruit people who can be advisors and mentors so that you can get the benefit of their experience. I think that's a key thing to think about, and a motion that if you do it well can help you be, a lot more successful than you might think at hiring the first salesperson or thinking about some of the business problems that you're going to have in addition to the technology and product problems.
So, having invested in definitely the highest number of IIT alumni-founded companies, is there a common thread in your mind in terms of the raw ingredients an IIT alum brings to the table, number one? And number two, the kind of partner both inside the company as well as the board level or investor level, that has really worked out in complementing, those raw ingredients in building a large company. So I'm curious if you can draw any conclusion from all these companies you have backed, where you thought there were some real strengths the IIT alumni brought to the table, and then there are some real partnership opportunities that they needed.
Yeah. Well, definitely, I think if I think back on the companies we're involved with, almost to a one, the technical architectures and the products, are winners. Now that doesn't mean that we've succeeded every time in having the company really grow to scale and dominate a market, but really in all situations, and I personally think if you're doing anything in the enterprise, the product architecture, it does have to have some, special superpowers, because otherwise the markets are so competitive and the large established players are, it's very hard to kind of enter and compete with them. So I would say, with the IITians we've backed, usually we've been able to kind of develop a product that has some level of superiority in what it can do. The flip side, I think the place where, again, there is commonality in all of those situations. It's been, people who, largely, they didn't grow up in the U.S., so this is sort of, the second home, and there's cultural differences. And when you have to, build a business, oftentimes it's going to be hiring people who, may not be from sort of the community that, people of Indian origin, the people that you mostly spend time with. And so it can be a hard thing when you're sort of thrust into the position of, responsibility, where you really have to, be the person who hires, I don't know, a sales force, hires your first marketing person, hires, the customer success person, hires the CFO. These people will look really different, and knowing how to do that in a way that you hire the right people, and frankly, then managing and creating accountability in an organization when it's not as simple as, maybe your batchmates from IIT that you've recruited and are, building the product, and it's almost an easy conversation about how you work with them. Those things, it's just, I'd say it's when you become an entrepreneur, if you have that kind of a background, the people like Dheeraj, you have to evolve in this other direction and get way outside your comfort zone, and learn to be, a person who can really extend into other parts. If you want to be, ultimately a CEO and a leader of a large company, not just a founder, that's a significant personal growth journey. And I think, and it's partly because of, maybe my personal background growing up, my cultural heritage. It's just, I think, there's a certain amount of needing, for me as an investor, when I've worked with IITians, it's partly about understanding that there's a lot of new things, new stuff that someone will have to do, and having the empathy to know that those transitions may be hard. They may be harder than for someone who, grew up in the US and is just more familiar with the, the other sets of people that are going to have to come into the company. And so it's a little bit like, I guess, knowing and being confident that people from the IIT community, I've seen it, I've worked with people, they can make that transition, giving them a little more, being there, being the support mechanism and saying, hey, we believe you can do it, and you may make mistakes, that's okay. We're not going to, remove you if you make mistakes. So I think that's where, it can be challenging. It can be very rewarding, for people who, who aspire to kind of walk down that path. But my learning is, it takes a certain kind of understanding as an investor to, to know what that journey is going to be like, and be understanding to the places where, people may make mistakes and may need to be, kind of supported through the tough times.
Absolutely. So, throughout the day, and I think even earlier today, one of the panels, people are asking like, I've had a great engineering career. I work at a large company today, but I'm dwelling on a certain idea for the last year or so. How do I get started? So your advice on any of that, like, how to think about getting started, particularly when, you're at a large company and, have an idea from your experience working with some of these other entrepreneurs.
Well, I guess if I had to sum it, be bold, think about a big idea. I think someone, maybe Jyoti said it on an earlier panel. If you're going to take your time and take the risk to go do this, figure out something that's big and interesting. Think about co-founders. If you are really strong in an area, do some, I think Bipul talked about this, think about the design of your founding team, and then go, find the people in your network who can make you really, robust as kind of an early team. Think about advisors, again, the people who you want to try to do some planning to really sort of get that, get that configuration right from the beginning. I mean, those are some key things. And look, the IIT network is an amazing network. I mean, it's amazing. There's like 1,000 people here today alone. But another thing that we have seen in the IITians we backed, great IITians attract other great IITians. And when you get 4, 5, 6 of you from a batch who I guess have above a certain rank number, yeah. I mean, you probably are going to be a group of people who can do amazing things that most sort of groups of people in the Valley wouldn't be able to do technically. So be confident about that. That's a real asset that you guys and gals have. So think about that if you're going to start a company and how to leverage that.
Excellent. So before I open it up to the audience for questions, one very important question. So which one is the best IIT in your opinion? I'm from Kharagpur as a hint.
I think we've been pretty equal opportunity and back people from all. That's the politically correct answer.
All right, that's a great cop-out answer. All right, we'll take questions from the audience, please. And please come up to the mic as you're asking.
Sure. Mukund Sivaraman, IIT Delhi. This is probably a usual question that you get asked. I mean, do you invest in people or ideas or potential for execution? And actually, a follow-on to that is, do you kind of invest in things that you believe in, or as a pure investor, which is what VCs are you looking to hedge by also investing in things you don't believe in, just as a hedge?
Well, yeah.
Good question.
If I invested in something I didn't believe in, then
Well, I mean, for instance, you gave this example of cloud-based security. And okay, that was an interesting idea, but then there's a case to be made to go the other way too. And as a hedge, it might make sense to invest in both.
Yeah, I mean, this is more, the way Lightspeed's invest, the way I invest, when I say, think of a bold idea, I mean, what do they say that, it's sort of, what's the most creative and bold ideas, some people might look at them as crazy or insanity. So when I say, for us, boldness is really understanding ideas that we think can be big, but it's certainly not clear at the time we invest. But we certainly have to be believers that state of the future can exist. But the more important thing you asked, is it about the idea? Is it about the person? And there's not. Venture capital is not a formula-based business, and so when we're getting involved, usually these companies, they take anywhere from 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10 years to actually develop. And so you have to believe that the idea is a really interesting idea, and you have to believe that the person that is going to execute the idea is the right person to really, go make that idea happen. And so there's a little bit of, it's not one thing, but I'd say, the two things that are most important that we talk about all the time in our partners' meetings are, idea, person, and, do those two things, get us really excited? And the other comment about venture capital, it's a very personal business. So, as a partner, and, I have other partners, we do, I think we see, I don't know what the metric is, thousands of opportunities a year. And each of us as a partner maybe makes 1 or 2 investments a year. So it's very personal, and you're really on the people side. You're looking at those people just like I think they're probably, as entrepreneurs, looking at you and saying, hey, do I really think this is a person that I can get behind, that I almost emotionally can kind of vest in and really just at every level. At Lightspeed, we're sort of saying we're the first investor. We're usually a lead investor. So we really have to believe we want to help this person succeed, whatever that's going to mean and whatever that's going to take over a very long period of time. So that's a big part of the calculus, too.
Hi, I'm Surya, 98 IIT Madras. My question is you glanced at the answer a little bit since I started walking out. But how do you measure the bigness or the boldness of the idea before deciding whether that's something that's that we want to, apart from, of course, the passion from the founder and other things that you probably look for, differently.
I guess it's like beautiful art. They say you know it when you see it. But a couple of examples. When Dheeraj and Ajit and Mohit, talked to us about Nutanix in the early days, they were saying, again, without getting too technical, you have this thing called a data center, and most of you will understand this. I don't have to dumb it down. But in a data center, you really have, storage arrays, network switches, and servers. And there's no way to deploy an enterprise class application without buying, those 3 things. And their concept at the time, it was sort of, a lot of people in the industry said there's no way it'll work. But their idea at the time was, look, processors are getting fast enough. You have this thing called solid-state storage devices. We're going to take basically just a standard server, manufactured in Taiwan or China, and we're going to basically write software that mimics the storage device. We're going to write software that mimics the network, and we're going to have basically software that runs, a virtual compute environment. We're going to put it all in this $50,000 box. And if we do that, it's very obvious. The value proposition is so obvious to an IT operations person. Instead of these 3 boxes that each cost $100,000, you're going to get this one $50,000 box, and it's going to do everything. That was a bold idea. And it bordered on, something crazy, because a lot of people said, well, it can't be done. It's technically too hard. You'll never be able to get the performance you need, and all of these sort of questions. And at the end of the day, we did our work, and we sort of said, maybe today it can't be done, but if you look at the kind of trend lines for where, price performance is going on memory and Moore's law for kind of the gigaflops you can get out of CPUs and multi-core, it's possible it could happen. Maybe not for sure, but it's possible. And then we looked at, Dheeraj and his co-founders and said, hey, these people are pretty remarkable. And if you look at the kinds of distributed systems they've designed in the past, it's possible that they could actually build this and get it to work. Not, a given, but we sort of said, if you take these two possibilities and you put them together and they are successful, it could be very transformational to an industry that, IT spend on computing and storage is, I don't know if it's $500 billion a year, but it's some number bigger than any of us could count inside the partnership. So we're like, we're in.
It looks like you're measuring the possibility and the pain point, like essentially, as I can, to summarize, essentially.
Yeah. It's tough to do things we found that are incremental. It's sort of like if something, and again, it's a judgment call, but it's worth thinking about. If you're going to start a company, don't think about how to be incrementally better, because usually, even if you can deliver something incrementally better, in terms of building, business model and business design, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. If it's 30% better and HP sells and they have a relationship with the customer, you're never going to get enough attention from the buyers to get on that kind of really steep growth curve.
Sure, thank you.
And we'll take these last two questions, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I think you touched upon one of those big mistakes about going against established players. But I was wondering if you can touch upon some other mistakes that people may have made, like a good team and a good area, but they did some stupid thing and they went down the hill. That was one. And if you want to maybe give some tips on some areas that you think are worth looking into.
Sorry, some areas worth looking into?
Yeah.
Look, good team in a good area. I might have been Bipul who referenced it earlier. If you're going to start a company, particularly in today's sort of times, competition is fierce. There's a lot of capital. Sort of life cycles for products are compressed. So it's there's great ideas all over the place, and there's actually smart people all over Silicon Valley. So if you decide to do a startup, this idea of, I think Bipul called it a war mentality, but being able to execute with precision and speed, that's a hard thing to do for the best people, and it requires, it's like running a sprint and a marathon at the same time. You have to really decide that you're going to do whatever it is that is your job in the startup with extremely serious intent. And so we've had situations where it's just, when people really get into it, it turns out how long the journey is going to be and how hard it is going to be. It weighs on them, and it ends up resulting in a situation where the company ultimately doesn't go all the way. I would say that happens, because some people you just don't know until you do it, until you sort of face the test, I guess, whether how exactly it's going to play out.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, hi, I'm Amit from IIT Bombay. My question is about how can a software technologist, become a VC? Does one need to have enough money, or do they need to have?
Yeah, if you have enough money, you can be your own VC.
Yeah, but how can one get hired by maybe a VC firm like yours or the VC arms of big corporations? If you don't have an MBA or something, is it still possible? And how can one go about doing that?
Sure. There are many paths. I always like to say there's not one, sort of standard path. But I think if you want to go into VC, first of all, VC is still, as much as the industry's expanded, it's still a relatively small industry. I don't know if there may be, a few thousands of people who are actually VC investors. So if you want to make that transition, you have to be very patient. You should network with as many people as you can. Try to meet VCs. Try to learn as much as you can about what the job entails. Sorry, Sudip, I may be having a bunch of people who are not going to swarm you after this. But you need to really educate yourself and then have a point of view. Because if you were going to an interview with a VC, the first thing they're going to ask you is, why do you think you would be good at this? And it's a bit of a test, because VC is hard in other ways, and so you have to really be prepared and have a view as to, if you know a lot about technology, that's one important thing. I will say at a firm like Lightspeed, people who haven't come up and had a technical background, it's almost impossible to be an effective investor in what we do, because we're talking to other technical founders where the product isn't even built and the market is probably 3 years away. You do have to have that foundation to say, hey, if you put these pieces of the stack together, to really understand, hey, can that enable something that's better or superior in the market? And I think that it is relatively hard to do that if you don't have a technical background. On the other hand, if you have a technical background, you need to believe that you also have the ability to sort of zoom out and say, hey, my understanding of technology is I can translate that into a view of what the market would want, whether it's a product or whether it's kind of the trend lines of how IT is being consumed. You need to believe you have that dynamic range to go from architecture on the low end all the way up to, hey, this is really the kinds of products people are buying, and I see how a new architecture could be more useful or more valuable. And so it's a little bit, you should figure that out about yourself. If you feel like that's something you have a lot of interest in, and you feel like you've got insights as you sort of tested yourself, then I think if you want to get into VC, network around, meet some VCs, have them have conversations with them, learn about the business, and if you persevere and it's the right fit, you eventually can make something happen. There's not a formulaic path. It's a very kind of opportunistic business in that way.
Absolutely. So we're out of time. Ravi, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great.